Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I got you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you all right. Sounds
Perfect.
perfect.
Sean, how's it going, man?
Good. Yeah, sorry I didn't get a chance. I've been so busy today with other stuff. I just didn't get a chance to get that email to you to switch dates back. But
Oh, no,
worked out pretty well.
yeah, no worries at all, man. I went to it's 6 a.m. here in Phuket, so I went to bed thinking like, I'm not. I wonder if we're gonna be doing it. So I figured I'll give it one last try. I set my alarm for 5 and just decided to reach out to you to see. But I'm super stoked that
Cool, man.
we get to do this. But we only have an hour, so why don't we just jump right into things?
Let's get going. That's fine. I mean, I'm not at a hard stop at an hour, but like I said, I've kind of got some life stuff, family life stuff occurs, and I got to take care of that stuff. So you're in Thailand, huh?
For sure. Yeah, yeah. I'm in Phuket, so.
Yeah, nice, nice.
Usually get the day going around 7 o'clock, go to a training session at Muay Thai, and then get into work. So it's a little bit earlier, but I got a strong black coffee in front of me, so I'll be fine. Um, so Sean, what I was gonna do is start with because I reached out to you and said, are you aware that the Bitcoin community there's a big I don't know if you want to call it movement or interest in the carnivore diet in the Bitcoin community. And I just assumed that you probably wouldn't be aware of that. But I saw a presentation that you gave, I think not too long ago, and you referenced Michael Goldstein. And anyone in the Bitcoin community knows that Michael is a longtime Bitcoiner, and he's also an advocate of the carnivore diet. So are you aware that the carnivore diet is such a big thing in the Bitcoin community?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know Safe Amos, he wrote the Bitcoin Standard. Yeah, he
Yeah.
and I have had dinner together. The website I have, meatheals.com, is something that Michael and I have worked on collaboratively. I started it and he agreed to help kind of do the technical side of it. Yeah, so I've been aware of that for a while. Some people like to call it, fiat food and fiat money.
Yeah.
Steak and Bitcoin are the antithesis of that, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. So should I infer that you're a Bitcoiner as well as a carnivore?
I am. Unfortunately, I haven't made the plunge there yet. I've kind of, I'm still too naive about that stuff. But I know Michael had agreed to help me set up a wallet, and I've got, Safe can advise me on that stuff. But I had somebody send me some Bitcoin, just kind of a little tiny bit on one of the alternate. I know there's a sort of a rivalry amongst the different coins, the cryptocurrencies, and I know some people like to call the non-Bitcoins the shit coins or the altcoins or whatever. So I'm still, you know, stepping back from that, but I'm not opposed to it at all. And at some point it probably will be part of my sort of portfolio, I suppose.
So did somebody send you a shitcoin? Is that what you're saying?
It was called. I can't remember what it was called. I mean, there's so many. It was like Bitcoin, but some special, a different edition. Like the oh, what the hell is it?
Bitcoin Cash?
It wasn't Bitcoin Cash. It was. Golly, I can't remember. It was like a. Who's the guy? Who's the guy that founded it? And I forget his name. I know the theoretical guy, the
Satoshi
Japanese guy.
Nakamoto. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like the Bitcoin Satoshi Nakamoto special edition, something something.
Yeah.
And I asked Michael about it, and he said, "Yeah, that's just stupid." So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I'm with Michael on that one. There's probably over 3,000 coins at this point, but the only one you need to concern yourself with, in the opinion of, I think the smarter people in the space would be Bitcoin. But as you said, I mean, it's a real. When I first encountered because I've been into health and fitness since I was 13, 14 years old. So pretty much my entire life, health and fitness has been a top priority. So tried all the diets, been training my whole life, that sort of thing. But when I first saw the kind of um, this carnivory, the carnivore diet pop up in Bitcoin, I was like, I didn't know what to make of it. But then as I looked into it further, I mean, it does make sense because as you said, in Bitcoin, people talk about fiat money a lot, right? Fiat that is, or money that is basically issued and has value by decree, or because you're forced to use it by legal tender laws, etc. And so the corollary there is that, well, there's two. One is that in that sort of a system, of easy money, of cheap money, and the way that the monetary system is structured, you get a lot of perversions along the economic in such an economic system. And one of them is lower time preference, and that can be in various dimensions, but one of them can be food. So you develop a society and a culture around people, making their food and nutritional choices based on what's easy, what's convenient, what's satisfying, and then on top of that, what other people tell them is good for them, i.e. the ridiculous food pyramids that have, morphed and changed throughout the years. And so I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of Bitcoiners are looking into this now, because they don't accept the dogma that's been handed down. And then the other one is that, I think a lot of Bitcoiners have either they got into Bitcoin because of this, or being in Bitcoin has kind of inspired this in them, a search for truth, not taking for granted any sort of information, but they want to know what the truth is. And perhaps that quest has led them down the road to a carnivorous diet, but it is still fairly, new. It's one of those diets that's just emerged over the last few years. I mean, I knew in terms of public consciousness, I know, we may have been eating this way for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. But for the people that aren't familiar with it, can you just describe what it is, the carnivore diet?
Yeah, I'd like to, just before I do that, echo, I think this, the people that come to this diet for whatever reason start to question, and they get the results they do, which, very often are good. They tend to question the overall narrative among a lot of things. And I think we see a significant overlap on people that have quote unquote non-traditional views on one topic will roll into another. And so that's absolutely the case. But the carnivore diet, in my, and I've got a book coming out called The Carnivore Diet that I wrote. And the way I like to define it is it's a diet that really is based upon, animal foods as the essential source of nutrition. And then what we do is we either eliminate or in some cases limit plant food, for the purpose of improvement or optimizing health. And I think that's, in a nutshell, or in a fillet, the crux of what the carnivore diet is. It's basically just realizing that meat is really human food. It's what really, again, if we can talk about evolutionary adaptations, it's what drove human adaptations, is what we really evolved, why we evolved, and what we evolved to eat. And that is, something that I think humans do very well when they get, a lot of human food.
Yeah. Now, this is kind of an affront to the way that the narrative has been shifting over the last 10, 20 years, because we see in culture and society a big shift towards vegan or popularity of veganism, or finding other ways to, these Beyond Meat and things of this nature, where people are doing their best to avoid meat. And then we have the various agencies telling us that it's good to reduce red meat and increase your consumption of, fruits and vegetables, but also grains and things like that, which again, I think we both know is founded on extremely questionable science, but nevertheless, this has become the dogma. And so when people hear a carnivore diet where you only eat meat, I think it's kind of shocking at first. When you discuss it with people that are coming to it the first time, how do you kind of overcome the disparity between what they've been told and where the kind of momentum and culture is shifting and what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and so I think this is very timely, because I don't know if you saw, the New York Times just released an article today, an international collaboration of scientists of all this said basically the advice to limit or cut back on red meat is bad based on really weak evidence. And so I think if we understand that nutrition science in general mostly is predicated on large population observational studies, which are just tremendously flawed. There's some people that say that they're almost a waste of time, and we should not do any more of these because we don't really get any really usable information from them. And so much of our nutrition, sort of knowledge, if you want to call it that, is based on very flawed and very poorly done and very much science that really can't tell us what we're supposed to do individually. I think that for most people, if they are at a point where they're questioning their own diet, you've got to ask them, well, what have you been doing so far, and has it worked for you? And if it's not working, why keep continuing on the path you're on? And so we know that there have been historical examples of people throughout history, and arguably it was more frequent the farther back we go, but certainly even in modern times, relatively modern times, there were entire societies that lived on basically meat-based diets. Now they may have had a few plants here and there, but generally they spent much of their time almost exclusively eating meat, and they were generally free of any modern diseases. And some people argue, well, they didn't live as long, but in some cases, like the Inuit, they smoke at a rate of about 70%. They start smoking at age 8. They live in abject poverty. They don't have access to any health care when we compare that with a modern society. But in general, they were free of diabetes and heart disease and cancer and all the modern sort of woes that so many of us are regularly seeing. I think between diabetes and heart disease, and cancer, that's something like 75% of the people in Western society are going to develop one of those three things. And so it's quite common. And so the first thing I like to tell people is, at the end of the day, we want to look at what results we're getting. Results should sway you more than anything else in your own personal results. And so I tell people, whether you believe it or not, I don't see any real downside for trying it for a couple months. What's the worst thing that can happen? You eat a bunch of steaks. It's not like you're going to develop colon cancer in 2 months. It's just kind of silly to think that. And so, at this point, it becomes easier and easier. When I was first doing this, it seemed pretty unusual. When I was on Rogan's podcast, even he looked at me like, "What the hell are you talking about, dude?"
Right.
But as time has gone by, and now we have literally tens of thousands of people that have gone through this, and they're all basically sharing the same experience. They are getting, in many cases, remarkably, surprisingly good results. And we're seeing diseases that would otherwise thought to be chronic and basically progressive and lifelong diseases are going away. People are coming off medications. The typical stuff. Losing weight, improving blood pressure, improving diabetes. That's happening too. But even more so, these sort of weird diseases that are thought to be, things we have to throw very expensive drugs at just to manage are actually going away, and these people are coming off medications. And so I think, at this point, I just point to the results. It becomes very easy.
Yeah. It's amazing. You referenced your appearance on Joe's podcast, and that was less than 2 years ago, right?
Yeah, it was funny. It was Pearl Harbor Day, 2017. So I remember when Joe invited me on, and he was giving me some dates. I said, "Let's do it on Pearl Harbor Day." And it was
nice.
kind of a funny, day to live in infamy. Maybe it'll do that again. Who knows?
But my point in bringing that up is just that's not a long time, and this thing has really over that the interim period there has gained a lot of traction. You've got more, more doctors, more, people in the health and nutritional space talking about this. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the Bitcoin space is hugely into this, and it seems to be. You've got people like Jordan Peterson and his daughter, who are, he is, obviously one of the most famous intellectuals of the current era, and he's out there saying that all he eats is steak, salt, and water. And it's just amazing the influence that food has on the body and the degree to which, well, people aren't aware of that. But like you said, I think part of the reason why this is probably spreading so quickly is because of the ways in which it helps you heal your body. We obviously there's a lot of vested interest in the status quo, food, nutrition, and medical system. But I think you just referenced this, but how many conditions that account for hospital visits are lifestyle and chronic illness issues. Your diabetes, your heart disease, your metabolic syndrome, all this kind of stuff. I think it's somewhere upwards of 80%. And if we're saying that these are unnecessary, that all they require is a change in diet and some lifestyle changes, that could have a potentially enormous impact on the medical system, and Medicare is a huge topic these days. If people would but one, educate themselves, and two, try it, and because all the people, as you referenced, it's Meat Heals, right? The website that you guys put up.
Yeah, that's one Michael and I put together. Yeah, and that's just a collection of a couple hundred people that have put up shared their information. I think
That's powerful.
it is powerful. Story, anecdote, stories change the world. They really do. You think about it. Whenever a big event occurs, it's usually some anecdote. You can think about World War One, where we have a shooting of a Duke, and all of a sudden we're in World War One. But The thought about, how it's grown significantly, and I think, uh, it kind of reflects, nowadays every nutritionist probably has an opinion about the carnivore diet. Now, most of them, it's an unfavorable opinion, but they have an opinion, so it's in the public conscious, particularly in the health and fitness and diet space. Just like Bitcoin, I don't think there's a banker out there today that isn't aware of Bitcoin. Even though many of them may, or whoever, an economist or something, they all have an opinion, some good, some bad, most
Right.
bad probably. I know you guys are aware of that. But the same thing's happening with this carnivore thing because it is so polarizing for the nutritional status quo. And you're absolutely right. If you have a simple, $10 solution to a $1 trillion problem, which it could be, and the $1 trillion problem is this growing healthcare crisis that we have, or I wouldn't say healthcare crisis, I would say it's a disease crisis, and we have a disease management industry which heavily relies upon the constant throughput of sick patients that get marginal symptom relief that we can continue to sort of feed into that through the pharmaceutical companies and whatnot. Yeah, it potentially has a huge impact. And I think one of the reasons, this isn't new. I mean, I certainly didn't invent people eating meat or only eat meat diets. I mean, historically, when I was doing research for the book, you can see it time and time again. Every few decades, somebody's talking about this and they're getting results. But we now share, in this age of internet, social media, infinite accessibility. I mean, these things can really reach a lot of people very quickly. And I think that is really moving the needle more than anything else. And I know a lot of people talk about fad diet's going to die out. 2 years it's going to be gone. That may or may not be true, but I think if the results continue to occur as they're occurring, particularly with people that are tired of having, name the disease, it's going to continue to grow. And then the question becomes, what do we have to do about the food system and so on and so forth, and how would this impact the healthcare system, or are they going to continue to, ignore it? The problem with the healthcare system, and as someone who's been in the healthcare system for most of his adult life, is we sort of pay lip service to prevention and lifestyle. We talk about it, but we don't really fund it. We really don't. There's no technology driven towards that. And that's something that, I'm actually working on right now with another team to try to maybe, develop something that may be viable and actually make sense from a financial standpoint. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard you say before that we need to be training an army of prevention specialists, and I couldn't agree more. I think we live in a society where people wait until their body breaks down before they do anything about it, and because they're lazy, because they don't want to take the responsibility. And also, one of the tricky things with diet is that, you emerge into the world, you're fed what your parents feed you typically, and then you develop food habits as a result of that, and you just think like, this is the way that I feel, like this is how humans feel based on what your diet and lifestyle is. And it's not until you begin experimenting with the various diets, the various fitness regimens and lifestyle regimens, that you begin to realize that tweaking it can change how you feel, and sometimes dramatically. So if you just think like, well, after lunch I get sleepy, that's normal for humans, right? We take a little nap or whatever. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe it's because of what you're putting in your body. And this is the one thing, because when I talk to people about this stuff, it's like, I feel fine, and usually my response is, well, yeah, but don't you want to feel great? Why are you satisfied with fine? And I think the answer is because they don't realize that there's a whole other dimension of how they could be feeling, energy levels and strength and mental clarity that's actually available to them when they're just shoveling in the standard diet crap. And again, I think that is why people become so passionate about this stuff, because it's like, wow, it kind of peels back the curtain a bit once you gain this freedom, especially if you're suffering from chronic illness. I know you're familiar with Michaela Peterson, and she's just had a litany of health problems throughout her life, which I'm incredibly sympathetic to. If you're someone like that in that kind of a situation, and you make this change, and 95% of those issues disappear in a relatively short period of time, I mean, how liberated of a feeling would that be? And knowing that all you didn't have to, take pills for the rest of your life. You didn't have to see the doctor once a week. You just had to change how you ate, and your life has been gifted this freedom as a result.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very important concept. And, like I said, as someone in their 50s, my perception, just based on observation, was most people as they get to middle age, they gain a little body fat. They, have some degree of musculoskeletal pain, whether it's back pain or knee pain or a little bit of that. They don't, their sleep quality goes down. They get tired. They lose muscle mass. Their quality of life goes down. Their digestion is what it is, which I thought was normal. But what I found personally, which was obviously very enlightening, was all those things for me went away. Every ache and pain I had, energy, digestive issues, the little bits of, sort of mental issues that you have, blood pressure, that just completely went away when I sort of adopted this carnivorous diet. And now, I mean, I don't accept being sore or having joint pain or any of that stuff. I think that's completely crazy to think that that would be normal even at the age of, nearly 53. And so I'm very fortunate. And it's been something that, many people, they just say they feel like they did in their 20s. And most of us, assuming we're reasonably healthy, we're in prime physical condition and function. And I would argue that that's probably how we're meant to be for the most part, for most of the time we're alive. And then, we should, drop dead, suddenly of something at age 90 or something like that. I'm not one of these people that thinks we're all going to live to 180 like some of the longevity people that are trying to convince people they know the way to make people live to be 150. And I just, that frustrates me a little bit because I think there's a lot of, you know, funny stuff going on in that space. But anyway,
There's a lot of products to be sold to people that want to live
yeah,
forever.
sure. That's exactly, and they never give you a money back guarantee.
Of course.
How do you, it's like, well, it's a good business to be in because you're like, yeah, you tell this 40-year-old, yeah, you're going to live to 120 and, you can make money off them for 20 or 30 years and before they change to something else. But,
Yeah.
It's so, like I said, until actually see human beings walking around at 120 years old that are robust, physically strong, and functioning extremely well, I don't put much faith in what anyone's telling me with regard to that. And so I always tell people, get healthy today, stay healthy as long as you can, and that's the best you can do, really.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think one of the important factors here is, I mean, with anything, but particularly with diet, is adherence. The level of success you're going to experience is dependent upon your adherence, your discipline, etc. And, simplicity is the quickest route to adherence, the most reliable route to adherence. And, I've like I said, I've tried everything. So I went down the route of, doing all the supplements, the longevity, the glutathione, the nootropics, all this kind of stuff. And I I always come back to simplicity because it makes my lifestyle easier. And you always make a trade-off, but I don't even find there's much of a trade-off to be made. I mean, when I keep my diet simple and my lifestyle simple, no supplements, none of that kind of stuff, it's not like I feel worse and I'm making a sacrifice. I feel just as good. It's just more simple and more cheap. So why bother with a cupboard full of supplements when if you eat a healthy diet based on healthy food, and we'll get in a bit more to exactly what that is, but keep it simple and keep it healthy, and you're 95% of the way there, and then maybe that's enough. I mean, what are you going to get out of all the supplements? Maybe you get a couple more years, but at this stage, especially in their development, I mean, I think technology might have some interesting breakthroughs for longevity and things like that. I don't know exactly what form they'll take, whether it's some sort of cellular repair or whatever, but it seems like the supplement industry, it doesn't have much to offer in that regard, at least not yet.
No, yeah, I agree completely. I think that compliance, and there's a friend of mine, you may know Stan Efferding. He likes to say compliance is a science, and basically, you've got to be able to do something. And what I tell people, I mean, the two ways that people fail on a diet is, one, they don't like what they're eating, and two, they're hungry all the time. And so if you have either of those things going on, I mean, your compliance rate long term is going to be pretty low, almost
Right.
zero. There's very many people that are sort of masochistic enough to eat food they don't like and or be hungry all the time. There's some people that can do that, but not very many of them do that, and that's why we have issues with long-term diet compliance and stuff. Because most of the diets ask you to live in some sort of caloric deficit or eat relatively unpalatable foods. These lots of greens and salad and basically flavored cardboard is what I like to call it. But so we don't we have a hard time sticking to stuff. And I think one of the advantages of a animal-based diet is most people tend to enjoy the food. It's very satiating, it's very satisfying, particularly as you get good at preparing this stuff. And then the other thing is it tends to satisfy your hunger requirements. And so I think those two things work very well for long-term compliance. And then the simplicity factor, it's like, if I have to sit there with a calculator and an app and 15 different supplements to figure out how to eat. I mean, it's really insane. If we look at any other animal in on Earth, outside of domestic animals that we kind of take care of and screw up their health as well. But any wild animal, I mean, you can't hand them an app and tell them how to eat. I mean, they're just gonna, it's kind of like teaching birds how to fly. I mean, you just do it. It's just a natural part of your bodily function. It's like trying to regulate how you breathe. I mean, it's like we just breathe. And eating should be similar in the same way as it should be as simple as you eat a food and then you eat it again when you're hungry, and that's all you got to do. And I think that's how most animals in the wild aren't worried about a balanced diet. They're not worried about moderation. There's a food that they're designed for. I would argue that humans pretty well are designed to eat, a meat-based diet. Now, I'm not saying that they never, obviously we eat an omnivorous diet, and that's probably been the case throughout much of our evolution, but I would say that the requirement to eat, a particular special berry or special plant being essential would have not been compatible with worldwide expansion of the human species. I mean, how could we have gone from Africa to Europe to Asia to North America to South America, across the South Pacific, if there were some particular plant nutrient that we required? Because we wouldn't have been able to do that. We would have remained isolated in Africa and likely have gone extinct, because as the climate changed, and this is what drove evolution, many people would say the climate changed about 3 million years ago, and it got very relatively cold, and then the tropical trees where all the primates were living in became very much restricted, and so most of the land was savanna, grassland, and very much significant change in nutrition availability, and therefore the adaptations that occurred after that.
Yeah, and if we look at 10, 15 year or 10, 15,000 year plus ago, so pre-agriculture, I mean not only the variety as you just mentioned, but if you look on a caloric density basis, I mean if you're a hunter gatherer, it's pretty damn hard to collect, and you have to understand, vegetables at the time were in most cases far smaller than they are now. They're not the kind of GMO'd and new manifestations of vegetables. I mean, it's a no-brainer. You take down some sort of large animal versus collecting berries for the day, and the large animal feeds you for weeks, if not months, depending on the size of your group, and berries satisfy you for a couple hours. So I think that's probably. I mean, is there much evidence? What's the evidence to that we have currently about like the earliest human diets?
Yeah, I mean, it gets harder. I mean, obviously, when you start looking through the evolutionary data, I mean, it's a lot of sort of speculation. I mean, there is some decent radioisotopic data, but this dates back 50 to 100,000 years ago that shows a predominantly carnivorous diet. There's some sort of teeth enamel stuff from Africa, which would go back farther, maybe a million years, looking at barium and strontium analysis, and they can figure out kind of the trophic level and where people eat, and those seem to indicate that humans fulfilled a carnivorous role, and their diet was consistent with other carnivores based on that data. I mean, there's coprolites and teeth enamel scrapings that people point to where it shows more of a mixed diet, but I think that there's no doubt that humans ate animals, and the question is how much of a percentage of the diet did it make up? My bias and what I've read certainly would point to a pretty heavily carnivorous-based diet. And again, your postulate about just optimal nutrients, strategy, how to obtain that. I mean, you think about it. If we know what kind of technology we had available, and I'll point to guys like Homo erectus, which were around about 1.8 million years, and they kind of came into play, about 2 million years ago, as they left Africa and went and ventured into Europe when it was much colder, and the animal sort of population was very different. We had lots of megafauna. We had these proboscideans, which would be elephants, mammoths, mastodons, and so on and so forth. They became very effective at hunting them, and they only required a spear. They didn't require any fancy technology. Just a simple spear was enough for them to take down these big giant animals. And you're correct that, if they would have had access to some fruits and maybe tubers, particularly the fruit would have been highly seasonal. And, it's hard to preserve, if we assume that the berries are ripening in the warmer months, you can gather some, but then you can't really freeze them. You can't really, you don't have, if you're gathering them in the warmer months, you don't have a way to really freeze them. So you can eat them up real quick. Remember, you're in competition with the birds and other animals that are eating these things. They're only sort of ripe for a couple of weeks out of the year. And so it could not have been a really viable long-term solution for, chronic nutritional needs. And,
Yeah.
some of the, most of the vegetables that we eat today weren't even invented. I mean, certainly even like I'll point to broccoli, which first made its appearance in the United States in 1920. So it's not like we could have been eating that thousands of years ago or tens of thousands of years ago. And so we've got very much a different selection of food available to us today in the supermarket than we had, even 200 years ago before we had modern transportation and refrigeration.
Yeah, I think I've also heard you mention on another podcast that, today, especially in the nutritional community, it's all about, finding all these different super nutrients and superfoods, from Japan or from the rainforest or from here and there, and putting it all together and constructing the best diet. But I mean, it seems the most rational or reasonable way to approach it to me would seem, what has the body evolved and been adapted to assimilate the best for optimal function? And that's certainly not, because as you mentioned, we were very dispersed, in our early human history, right? We couldn't collect and aggregate all those different things, and we certainly couldn't rely on them, throughout the year, versus, a highly dense nutritional source like meat, where, it was in all places where humans existed, a form of it was available, and you have to presume that is the basis on which, the human body evolved.
Yeah, I mean the concept of the balanced diet or the eat the multicolored diet or eat
Right.
foods that are grown all over the world. I mean, you think about it. What other animal, if you had an animal in the zoo who grew up in Australia, you would not be feeding them food that's native to Europe or North America. Or I mean, you wouldn't do that. That would interfere with their system. You'd want to try to reproduce their native local food source, and that's what we would expect to happen with humans. And so to think that one particular human is adapted to eat food from every single continent, particularly when it comes to various different plants, is kind of silly. And it's no wonder that we might have some problems. And that doesn't even account for the post-industrial diet that we now sort of pretty much overwhelms or dominates our diet. We had the pre-agriculture, the post-agriculture, now the post-industrial diet, which is even farther removed from what we were probably designed to eat.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, in the Bitcoin space, we're fond of saying the quote or the hashtag Bitcoin fixes this, but what we mean by that is a monetary standard predicated on Bitcoin would cause this problem or issue to disappear or greatly improve it, and as you were saying that, I just think, like, how fucked up is the modern food system? I mean, you look at a grocery store and a huge percentage of it is carbs and sugar, and various forms of fat and oils and stuff like that too, but, and the bad kinds. But how much would a return to a diet more in line with, what we're adapted to benefit the most from? How would that permeate through society in all the different ways, in mental health, in physical health, in mood, in productivity, it's staggering to even think that, because we seem to have gone so far the other direction where, I mean, it's almost a wonder that we're civilization is here at all based on that. But I mean, we're getting our calories, we're able to survive, but it's always crazy to me how it's not obvious. We always talk about the medical system and Medicare and how it's overburdened, how much money it's costing to operate, and still so much criticism and so inefficiently, that we don't look at the root cause. This is what we look at in Bitcoin. What's the root cause of a lot of problems we see in society? Well, society is predicated on the monetary standard that it uses. And so if you're trying to look at root causes of problems, you're going to have to go back to that to try to fix them, rather than trying to, hit down every symptom when it pops up. And I feel like, again, this is probably why Bitcoiners are so attracted to this, is because it's coming at things from a foundational perspective and saying, if we could but fix this, how many other things would naturally resolve themselves, and how much better would society and culture be as a result?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly, in the nutrition and health space, I mean, I think that, just looking, back to agriculture, you mentioned, 12, 15,000 years ago, 10,000, whenever we want to accept that agriculture became a significant source of human nutrition, we saw just a complete sort of degradation of the human's individual human health. I mean, before that, we can look clearly at fossils from, pre-agricultural populations to agricultural populations, and differences night and day. I mean, humans actually lost about 200 cc's of brain size, going onto a grain-based diet. We got smaller. We lost about 6 inches in height. Our bone structure became weaker. It became diseased. Our teeth, same thing, lots of dental problems. And these are the things we can see in the record, and we can only imagine what other issues people had, with infectious disease problems and chronic disease starting to see. And we started to see heart disease, even in ancient Egyptians, when we look at some of the mummies, and they were, largely a grain-based society. But, we go back to the modern age where, everything, nutrition, food, I mean, basically is about shelf life, product stability and profit. I mean, this is the reason food companies make food. It's not to sort of preserve or improve our health. I mean, it's to give us cheap calories so we shut up and don't complain about being hungry. But I mean, they certainly, it's to their advantage to make it tasty and addictive. And they're very good at doing that. And they figured that out. They figured out that algorithm with the bliss point and so on and so forth. And so to disrupt that, I think if you could because there are people that utilize the healthcare system, disproportionately. You've got the sickest of the sick that use up something like 80% of the resources. And so if you could target those people and say, look, we're going to actually subsidize your nutrition and put them on supervised, meal plans and lifestyle plans, you could probably make a huge dent. And then the rest of the people can kind of pick and choose where they want to be, how whether we subsidize that or not. I mean, I just wonder if we had, I think the food industry is huge. I mean, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and so they've got their interests, and they want to preserve status quo and continue to enlarge their market and develop new markets. But are there other markets or other market forces that could sort of come in and totally revolutionize that through a more whole food based approach, in my view, an animal food based approach? And I think you might see large companies that employ people, insurance companies, the insurance industry, just the overall employment industry. They might have enough vested interest to say, hey, look, we're going to subsidize not only the health but the nutrition of our employees. And would that be enough? Is that powerful enough to do this? Right now it's kind of still a grassroots movement, and just a bunch of people, jumping and yelling on social media. But to make a profound change, I think you're going to have to involve some big players, in this overall picture.
Yeah, you may be right, and I'm just hoping, because that is relying on, you're trying to lobby certain groups or whatever to put the proper funding or behind this or attention on this. These large corporations and will adapt to our demands, because ultimately they want our money, and fair play. That's how markets work. So if enough of us are demanding a certain thing, and so in this case, better food, and we're willing and able to pay whatever premium is required, then people will offer it. And I know in the States this is, it's probably the place with the most options now, but you've got all these smaller companies, popping up that offer subscription boxes with, high quality meats and, paleo products and all this kind of stuff. And of course it's still relatively small portion, but hopefully through our demand, those ones will be the ones that get bigger, and more people will demand them. The cost will come down, and at the end of the day, it's up to us, right? Our demand and the choices we make is what creates the big companies around us. So, it's all a matter of us making the right choices and the choices that serve us, But one of the other corollaries to Bitcoin is this idea of sovereignty, right? If somebody else is controlling the value of your money, they can inflate it away, they can restrict your access, et cetera, then you don't have financial sovereignty. So, that's another big part of Bitcoin is being in control of your money. But the other, with the diet thing, and one of the issues that I'm very interested in is the impact on mental health. Especially for young people these days, mental health is such a, depression and mood disorders and suicide and these things are alarming at this stage and seemingly growing problems. And again, it seems to be overlooked, the role of diet in this process, because the standard American diet, the modern diet, is, most people would agree, is highly inflammatory, and we're starting to realize that inflammation is one of the big drivers behind depression, mood disorders, or, for lack of a more all-encompassing term, relinquishing kind of the sovereignty over your consciousness, having too many factors impacting your conscious sovereignty. And if you just remove those, if you stop, remove the meddling, as it were, remove the inflammation, then how much of a resolution in some of those issues would we see? I mean, what's been your experience with that and the people that you've been helping and sharing this information with?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Many people fail to believe or recognize that our brain participates in our overall physiology just like any other organism does. And when we look at what is a indicator of proper brain physiology, I mean, many times it's our mental health. It's how we communicate. It's how we think. It's a stability of our mood. And so certainly it is almost ludicrous to think that what we eat does not play a role there. And, what I am seeing very frequently, in fact, it's one of the more common things I see, is that people that go on a meat-based diet that have issues with either anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, things like schizophrenia, even autism, note often a dramatic and significant improvement in their symptoms. Many people that are on lifelong antidepressant medications are able to completely come off of that. And so it is clearly playing a much bigger role than we think it is. And I think what we're seeing within the population, that mental health disorders are skyrocketing. If we look at the incidence of depression back, around World War II compared to where they are now, and it's something like 400 or 500% increase. I mean, the number of suicide attempts is going up. The kids on antidepressants is going up dramatically. And some of that obviously is a greater propensity to prescribe more drugs for these things, or to cast a wider net to diagnose. Every behavior out there has to have a diagnosis attached to it. Right. And then therefore there's a medication that you can provide for them. But yeah, I mean, it is, I'm highly impressed by the amount of people that resolve mental health issues by changing diet.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, you're so right, and it's so crazy that any deviation from some, poorly articulated norm of behavior is now a pathology of some kind. Like, oh, you're a little bit more active than the rest of the kids, or you're a little bit underactive, or you're a little bit too inquisitive, or you ask too many questions, you put your hand up too much. There's a classification, and as soon as there's a classification, someone's going to provide a quote unquote solution for that. It's, we got a lot of work to do, I guess, but that's I'm sure part of the motivation for you in sharing this knowledge and spending the time and writing books and doing podcasts like this is just, you realize how important it is, so you try to get as much information out as you can. I want to get into a couple of nuts and bolts here. So I guess I'll start with, one is a couple people that talk about the carnivore diet. There's a few different approaches, I guess I'll say. And so I think yours is more, steak and water and salt and a couple other things on the peripheries is sufficient. And other people talk about nose to tail because there may be some nutrients that we're missing in just, eating steaks. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, what I sort of espouse is based on the results that I've seen, observing, now tens of thousands of people. And so I think, when we're looking at what we recommend, there's theoretical sort of recommendations based on, speculations that sometimes don't necessarily apply, or there's, hard endpoints. What I like to say, what actually happened when people did this particular thing. And so while my diet is generally pretty simple, it's mostly steak, and sometimes I'll have some eggs, and once in a while a piece of seafood and a little bit of dairy here and there. There are other people that want to say, well, I really want to make this diet make sense to everybody else that is sort of under the impression that the RDA numbers are set in stone, and Moses got them from God and handed them down to everybody else. Whereas when we actually look at the RDAs, we realize that there's very significant flaws in the way those things were derived and calculated. And so what I see is an attempt to stick a square peg into a round hole. And so we're trying to make this diet match the diet that assumes nutrient sufficiency, assuming everyone is eating a grain-based high-carb diet with all the attendant problems that come with that, which drive up nutrient requirements, which have a number of anti-nutrients, which prevent absorption of those nutrients. And so I don't think we even know what the RDA for a carnivore is. And I would say that we've got, the people that have been doing this the longest, you talk about outside of the historical 3 million year history of this, but the people we can study and talk to today that have been doing it the longest, really they tend to do it the simplest way possible. They generally steak and water and some other things if they enjoy them, but they don't really rely on those things. But there are other people out there that are pushing it nose to tail, and many of them think you got to eat the organs raw. And I don't think that's necessary. I haven't found it to be true in my particular situation. And I've sat there and literally broken world records as an athlete on nothing but steak and water. I've been doing this for nearly 3 years now. And so I think at some point, if those nutrient deficiencies were going to manifest themselves, I would see something, at least in athletic performance. You don't break world records when you're sick. I mean, that just doesn't typically happen. And so it's kind of sometimes that frustrates me. I'm not opposed to that approach at all. I think if it works for you, do it. But to make a sort of general consensus statement that all people need to do this makes it more complicated than it needs to be. And it sort of dissuades a lot of people from trying it, because a lot of people are like, I really don't like eating raw brains. I mean, I don't know that I can get into that. Right. And they'll dismiss the diet. When I tell people, hey, just go to Wendy's and get some burger patties, you're fine. That is more accessible to the majority of the people. And I think if we want to impact, the most people and sort of rescue the most people, it has to be a simple solution. It has to be accessible both financially and accessible both, from a mental standpoint, to get their head around what they need to do. And when we overcomplicate things, it really, like we talked about, it provokes anxiety. We get into what supplements do I need to take. And I would say it doesn't seem like there's a diet that, a diet doesn't seem like it makes sense if we have to heavily supplement that or over supplement that. The thing about the organs, I think the behavior we see, if we look at human beings, they started out most likely as scavengers. And so the organs were already picked off and gone long before we were able to access the meat. And so we probably spent a lot of time early on just eating, whatever meat was left over. It would have been rib meat, muscle meat, hindquarters. Maybe we got into some bone marrow and some brain, but that probably wasn't the majority of our calories. And even if you look at a giant animal, the vast majority of its calories are coming from the muscle itself, the muscle meat. And we don't know what happens in a surplus situation. I think early humans were in a surplus situation. And when we observe modern tribes, they're often in a subsistence situation. So they're eating the skinny animals. They're eating, they're having a hard time getting them because they've been forced off. Modern humans have kicked all the hunter-gatherers off to the edges of the earth, and now they're in these little horrible places that they wouldn't have normally chosen to live, and now their animal selection is harder, so on and so forth. And we killed off all these megafaunal animals 25 to 50,000 years ago, and so we ended up with a very different food choice than we have now. And so I think the organ-seeking behavior that we see is probably fat-seeking, because if you think about lean animals, and I'm not talking about big fat elephants, I'm talking about antelopes, which we ended up having to hunt later on. There's no fat on those animals. And so the only place you're going to get the fat is around the organs. And so some of that behavior to eat organs is probably just fat. And there's fat-soluble vitamins in there. But if you can get fat through, another source, and that's why a lot of people that do this long-term preference things like ribeye steaks or fattier cuts of meat because they're getting the fat soluble vitamins to the amount that they need. Obviously, they're getting enough protein, and it seems to be doing them just fine. There's just, I surveyed this carnivore population. In 24 hours, I got 10,000 response. I got 10,000
Wow.
people submitting survey data to me, and 85% of the people did not eat organs on a regular basis.
Right.
So it was like 85% of us are not eating any significant amount of organs. A significant percent never eat them, and the results across the board are pretty much the same. As far as general populations on people reversing disease, coming off medications, seeing subjective and objective measures of health getting better. So I tend to step back and say, if you want to do it, that's fine. But if you want to prescribe that, that's the only way to, even thrive is in my view, incorrect.
Yeah. Now you just mentioned, the Wendy's burger patty, being a better alternative or, more convenient than whatever else. Another place where you seem to diverge a little bit from other people in the space is you don't overemphasize the benefit of a, grass-fed, free-range sort of thing versus, your typical potentially industrial farmed, cattle, steak, etc. And you say that the difference is relatively negligible. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this also again goes to accessibility for the average person. So there's a lot of belief out there that, eating, a steak that you get from the grocery store is like poisonous. I mean, oh my God, it's got, a nanogram of estrogen in it, and it may have had antibiotics 6 months ago. This is sort of the belief is how that is somehow some inferior, awful food, and that if you're going to eat that, you might as well eat Oreos. Absolutely the problem here is if we demonize that food, we are knocking out, something that's probably 99% as beneficial as one of these other products, these grass finished organic products, and discouraging people from doing this. And so while I don't discount the value of raising animals in a regenerative fashion because it does have an impact on the environment, I think that's something we need to support, and I'm extremely supportive of that. I'm constantly saying we need to do that, either if we can afford to do that for the people that can afford it, and many people can't, or even just vocally supporting these guys and getting behind these guys and vote with your capacity to vote when that comes up, or just letting these people know they're doing a good job. But the data, and the same thing. When we look at people that eat grain finished versus grass finished, really no difference in the outcomes. At least from when I've surveyed these people. Texas A&M did a study on this a couple of years ago, looking at this specifically. There's very little human data where we've actually looked at humans that eat grass finished versus grain finished and see what happens to them. And the study they did, was looking basically at biomarkers. It was mostly looking at blood lipids and I think blood pressure. And there was no significant difference between the two. And in fact, the grain finished group had a slight advantage, maybe a little bit higher LDL compared to the grass finished. But it really wasn't significant enough for me to say it makes a difference one way or the other. And that's been the experience of the community. I encourage people, if they can afford it and they enjoy it, because, quite honestly, some people, again, this goes down to liking the food you eat. Some people just don't find grass-finished beef that palatable. I mean, it depends. I think it depends on where you come from and what your background is and where you've raised and what you've grown up with.
Mm-hmm.
But there's certainly a lot of people that really like beef that's finished on grain. The taste of it, it's got a better, many people think it has a better fat flavor profile. And so, while I think there is improvements we can make across the board in all of agriculture, whether it's plant or animal agriculture, to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, hey, let's just make all cows on grass, I think is kind of short-sighted, and I think there's more nuance to that than we give it credit for.
Yeah, and does the same hold true for your approach to wild game meat in terms of the nutrition, like setting aside the maybe moral or non-nutritional argument there, where the animal might have enjoyed a better life if they were free to roam for the majority of their life versus being in some sort of a farm, but nutritionally, is that the same hold true for wild meat?
Yeah, so wild meat is fine. I think if you're a hunter and you like getting venison or elk, that's a great source of food. I think there's Some of the animals, the only problem some people run into is they're a little lean. And so, we know that if you're eating a meat-based diet, you got to get energy from somewhere. And if it's all protein, it's difficult to do. So you need enough fat. So some people will find they need to augment their fat, with you know, tallow or something like that to kind of round that out. But I think, the argument about quality of life for these animals, again, we have to realize that chickens aren't pigs and pigs aren't cows, and there's a big difference between the way these are raised. I think chickens probably have the worst, life experience as far as this industrialized farming goes for those ones that do that. They're usually 5 weeks and then they're slaughtered, so they don't have very long of a life. Cows, for instance, and I've been with a lot of ranchers and been on feedlots. I mean, those guys actually have it pretty good. I mean, they spend the majority of their life in pasture, regardless of how they're finished. They're not like some people seem to think they're stuck in a box and fed corn from the day they wean from their mom, but that's not the case. I mean, they are roaming in the fields on grass. Then they spend a couple months, 3 months typically in a feed yard where they're still getting grass and forage, and then they gradually add a little bit more grain. And the grain is only about 10% of their diet, and they have actually quite a bit of room to move. By law, they have more room than they even use. I mean, they've got every cow is required 200 square feet, at least in the United States, which is a lot of room.
Yeah.
And they never use it all because they're herd animals. And what they do, anytime you go, they always pack together because that's what herd animals do. That they cluster because they're worried about a predator, and that's just their natural sort of instinctive behaviors, just to kind of cluster together. And so when you have these pictures of feedlots and you got cows clustered together, it's not because they're forced to, it's because they, for the most part, for most of their time, they're wanting and choosing to do that. And so I mean, yeah, like I said, it's much more nuanced than we think it is. There's work to do in all arenas. I think if we listen, we told the agricultural industry, the animal agriculture industry, hey, cut back on methane emissions and water usage and so on and so forth back in the 70s. And since that time, they've reduced those emissions and water requirements and feed requirements by something like 30%. I mean, they've done better than almost any other industry. Like we could compare that to the transportation or energy sectors where they haven't made the strides at the animal agriculture industry. And we know we have, there's technology out there that's going to allow even further improvements, and both with regard to animal welfare, safety, and efficiency that can be utilized.
Yeah, well, you bring up a good point in the environmental component of the carnivore diet, and I'm sure you've drawn the ire of certain elements of society because there's a lot of press in the mainstream these days about the negative impact of animal agriculture, particularly beef and cattle, whether it's cutting down the rainforest to grow soybeans for feed or for cattle farms and stuff like that. And there's just been, or if it's cow burps, cow farts as they're called. How much have you looked into that? Do you think there's much validity to it? What's your response?
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at it extensively. I've talked with experts from all over the world about this issue, and I think compared to the average physician or layman, I'm pretty well versed on this stuff. And so there's a lot of oversimplification of this sort of this concept. And so just in general, when we talk about the greenhouse gas emissions, that seems to be the hot button right now, that people are worried about, climate change. And, obviously there's people that don't feel that man is contributing to that. But whether or not wherever you fall upon that argument, if we're staying within the framework that man is causing climate change, then we have to look at the big picture and put things in real perspective. And so the FAO, which many people would cite as a credible reference for saying how much greenhouse gases are used in the EPA, which would be another credible source. Worldwide, they'll say that 14% of greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture, which is not an insignificant amount, and probably about maybe 2/3 of that might be coming from the cow. So we would say 9% or something like that worldwide. And this is based on a life cycle assessment. So every little thing that goes into making a cow, from the crops that are planted that they're fed for those that get grain, to the transportation, to the packaging, to the butchering, to the slaughtering, everything that goes into making that cow is calculated in that life cycle assessment. Unfortunately, they didn't do the same for transportation and energy, because with transportation, all they did was count what comes out the tailpipe of the car. or the back of the jet. And they didn't calculate, you got to build the planes, you got to build the runways, you got to build the roads. All of that has an impact on the environment. Well, but they didn't count those. So it's really an apples to oranges comparison. But even beyond that, if we say that the 14% of animal agriculture that is contributing to greenhouse gases, we have to realize that something like 70 to 80% of those gases are not being emitted in developed countries. Most of that is coming from third world countries or developing countries, things like places like India and sub-Saharan Africa and, parts of Asia where they don't have very efficient animal agriculture practices yet. In fact, it's estimated that 70-80% of all animal agriculture is still like Stone Age technology or 1,000 years old. I mean, they're still raising these things, and it's very inefficient. The animals aren't very healthy. They're not sort of well bred to produce efficient amounts of meat. And so if you could change that, you could literally double the food population, the animal agriculture production just by making those simple changes around the world. But if we look at developed countries, and I use the U.S. because I've got pretty accurate and recent numbers on the U.S. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions throughout by economic sector, we see that agriculture in the U.S. is about 9%. Animal agriculture only accounts for about 4% of that, whereas plant agriculture accounts for 5%. And then among that 4%, only about 2 of it comes from cows. So cows produce about 2% of our greenhouse gases based on carbon equivalents. That includes methane in the United States. And then we compare that to the transportation, energy, and industrial sectors. And between the three of those, it's something like 82%. So we have 2% versus 80%. And then we're talking about how much impact would it be for me to give up beef? And so the calculations on this have been done. If you look at the U.S. emissions totals and take 2% of that and compare it to the world totals, if we were, and just say we were to make every single person in the United States go on a vegan diet, and we were somehow magically able to make all the cows disappear and the pigs and the chickens and the horses and the cats and the dogs, because cats and dogs actually contribute to our environmental footprint, believe it or not. In fact, much more than you'd think. But if we were to do that and make all the animals disappear and everybody went vegan, the difference in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide would be 0.36%. So, I mean, it's like, what are you gaining by making every person in the United States a vegan, all 330 million of us? Basically nothing. And so the only place you would have a significant impact would be like saying, go to India and make everybody in India a vegan and kill all their cows, and that's going to piss them off because their cows are sacred. Or go to Russia or go to China and kill all those cows and make all those people vegan. Then you might have something like a 5% difference or something like that. But it's still impractical, implausible, and it's fraught with all kinds of problems. We know that if we take animal agriculture out of the system, the agricultural system will, first of all, it will collapse. But beyond that, if we were to pretend we could feed everybody with plants, you would see critical nutrient deficiencies in numbers of things like iron, zinc, lysine, to name just a few. And so we would see a nutrient-deprived population, which probably would have sufficient numbers of calories, by the way. We could feed them calories, but they would be, kind of what we have now, a bunch of fat people that are nutrient-deprived.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, we're probably seeing a version of that right now in the way that people are eating. And when you're describing this, I'm seeing so many similarities between, because the media latches onto something oversimplified metric and then just puts it on the loudspeaker, and that's the download that everybody gets, when really there's so many nuances to this. And there's so many comparisons to Bitcoin. People talk about Bitcoin's energy usage, and it's boiling the planet because it uses this much energy. But similar to what you were just mentioning with meat, whatever the actual negative impact is, and I take your point that it's probably overstated and certainly wouldn't be resolved if everyone just shifted to a vegan diet. What is the value of, there's some limit where it's acceptable, right? Because if everyone was on a diet which promoted longevity, which reduced chronic disease, which means it reduces the burden on the medical system and all the different negative impacts on society and environment that has, all the positive benefits that could be derived from people, eating a better diet, they're more productive, they're more stable, longevity, less burden on the system. Those are things you pretty much can't measure. But whatever that the answer to that is there is a point at which you'd say, well, all of that is worth a certain amount of negative impact. Now, I'm not being an apologist for environmental degradation. I'm very much concerned about the environment. I want to preserve it to as much as possible. But these sensationalist arguments and things that are said in the media don't do anybody any good, because it diverts our attention from seeking the truth of the matter and understanding all the different ways in which it impacts to the upside and to the downside. And I think, as we've been discussing this whole time, there's a tremendous amount of upside to the human body getting the nutrition it needs. And I think a lot of the issues that we see in society today, from many different perspectives, health and social welfare and all that kind of stuff, would be dramatically improved if that were more the case, if people were putting, better fuel into their bodies.
Yeah, I mean, and some of that we can actually measure. I mean, if we look at the U.S. healthcare sector, I mean, it puts out 10% of our greenhouse gases.
Right.
And so if cows are producing 2% and the healthcare sector is producing 10%, well, if you're no longer participating in the 10% healthcare sector because you're healthy, and this is the case I'll make, is people are coming off medicine, they are getting out of the healthcare sector when they go on a high quality, animal dense, nutrient dense diet. They no longer rely on that environmentally damaging healthcare sector. When I worked in the healthcare sector, doing surgery, I mean, we made so much trash. I mean, it was incredible. One operation would fill up 12 trash bags. It was just like insane the amount of garbage we would make. And the other thing that we've seen, and again, doing surveys on people on this diet, they eat a lot less food. They produce a lot less waste. They don't produce as much plastic and glass and, cardboard and all these things that we fail to sort of account for compared to people that eat a more processed or even a plant-based diet, which has, probably an order of magnitude more packaging material. And, the amount of food we waste in the United States, I mean, it's something like 40%. The majority of that is rotting fruit, rotting vegetables, and baked goods. I mean, this is what we're throwing away for various reasons. And I mean, I can't remember the last time I've thrown out any meat. I mean, it's been forever, and even if there's something that I'm worried about, I'll give it to my dog. So we're at least, making zero, almost as little waste as possible coming from my house relative to my neighbors who eat, a mixed diet or even a vegetarian vegan diet. And so it's how we frame it. You're right. People like to define the argument in the set of, in a narrow window, and they get to determine what the metrics are. And you say, wait a minute, what about this? What about if we broaden the scope of the conversation? Then it starts to become less unclear and more nuanced and more subtle, and we get a bigger picture of how does this all play out. I'm with you. I don't think we should be destroying the planet. When we see India and China dumping gazillions of gallons of tons of plastic into the ocean, I mean, that's probably a bigger issue than me eating a steak in California. I mean, it's just, where do we want to fight the battle and what's going to actually make a big impact and what are the pros and cons? And I think there's a lot of people that are excited and they feel, particularly the young people that are kind of co-opting this environmental movement and trying to make it a dietary movement. I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah.
And I think that's I think, for better or worse, it's bringing the discussion, I think, with the political climate right now, it's bringing the discussion to the table, and I think it needs to be, but I think it needs to be looked at, in a very broad way and put a microscope on everything and really challenge these assumptions. And like I said, it was very nice to see some of the pushback from people that are, sort of pro-meat, putting out stuff and say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at this science. Yeah. And we're challenging that. And like I said, we've got a scientific study coming up on the carnivore community that will be published, done by a major university coming up, and I think that's also going to be something that's going to change the narrative a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more in that, one, we all know that the media is so sensationalist and clickbaity these days, right? I mean, they just care about clicks and engagement, and that doesn't lend itself to a balanced, nuanced argument. But I think, as you were saying, the benefits versus the negative impacts, they're not netted out. People just focus on one of the negative impacts. And as you said, if there's a 3% negative impact from animal agriculture and a 10% from, the medical system, if you adopted, if more people ate, a healthier diet based on, let's say, the carnivore diet in this case, how much net benefit would you get by diminishing or decreasing the negative impact from the medical side? So it's these sort of issues that it's just not, it's not popular. It's not good media, right? It's not something that people click on. And as you said, I mean, I'm concerned about it too, because, the recent thing with Greta, and like, look, I think it's awesome that a young person, if it is, genuinely motivated and she's not being manipulated in whatever way, I think it's great that she's got the courage and the, the altruism to try to do what she thinks is best to mitigate her perceived, concerns about the environment and the world. But I don't think it's good to drum up all this emotion and get people to scream and yell and jump on the streets and think that that's the way that we're going to, reduce whatever negative impact we may or may not be having. I think it's, in the individual daily, hundreds per day choices that we make that's going to, that's going to determine what kind of world we get. And I think that's lost on a lot of people. They think, no, I'm just going to hold up signs and somebody else is going to make that change for me, when really it's, it's all those many decisions we make every day that's going to dictate the types of companies we have and what kind of products and services they offer us and that sort of thing. Shawn, we're a little over an hour. Do you have a little bit more? I got a little bit more for you.
Yeah, I can hang around for a few more questions. Sure.
Okay. So one thing you mentioned that I think a lot of people think about that I wanted to get your take on is LDL, right? A lot of people say if you go on a carnivore diet, then doctors have always said, people that have maybe at risk for heart disease, etc., reduce your red meat or eliminate your red meat. That's often prescribed. People are afraid that their LDL will skyrocket on a carnivore diet. Now, over the last 10 years, let's say, there's been a lot of research that's come out that's been changing that's provided more clarity on the role and the risks or lack thereof of LDL, whether it's impacted by the diet. If it is impacted by the diet, is it a negative? Is that the metric we should be looking at? However, that new information doesn't seem to have permeated the medical culture yet. So what's your response to the carnivore diet LDL question?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a very common one. Just in practicality, what we see when people do check this, and I don't like to have people check it right away because weight loss can impact our blood lipids a lot, and there's a lot of dynamic changes going on that may not reflect long-term the long-term picture. I see many people where their LDL actually goes down. Many people where it doesn't change at all, like my case, it didn't really do much. And there are certainly a subset of people where we do see elevated levels of LDL, in fact, even fairly high, 300 plus. And so I think when we look at cardiovascular disease risk, LDL, has been considered a risk factor, and part of, the development of atherosclerosis requires cholesterol to be present. I mean, it's part of the process. Doesn't mean it is the only thing driving that, and so it's multifactorial. And so I think that you have to sort of, again, step out, look at the broad picture, and look at all of the things that potentially affect your risk, and those things, some of which you can control, some of them you can't. Your age, your sex, your parental history you have no control over, but your diet, whether you smoke or not, whether you exercise, what your blood pressure may or may not be, if you're diabetic, if you are inflamed, those things are all modifiable generally, and diet seems to do that. And so what I generally see is pretty much every single modifiable risk factor outside of LDL tends to improve on the carnivore diet. So that is to say that people that are struggling with diabetes, prediabetes, generally see that improve. People that have elevated inflammation, inflammatory markers, that improves. Things like blood pressure tend to improve. So it's kind of one of those things where I don't ignore LDL. I think it's important to just put it in perspective and risk. There are sort of calculators, risk calculators out there. One I like to use is called the MESA calculator. It stands for the Multi-Ethnicity Study on Atherosclerosis. And so they take a number of different factors, and you can plug it in and see what your risk is like. if you are, so there are probably situations like if you've just had a heart attack or you are, very, very sick and inflamed and irritated and diabetic, and, maybe in that situation, skyrocketing your LDL may be problematic. And so that's something where you might have to say, well, I'm transitioning and improving those other risk factors. I might have to do something with my LDL, whether it's take a medication or vary the diet a little bit, maybe select more different types of fats that do seem to, have a role there. So like I said, it's not that I discount it at all, but I think also, again, it's the problem we have with population data and which cohort we're dealing with. We don't really have data on this population, which I live in. We don't have data on low carb, ketogenic, carnivore diets with regard to what does LDL do to their clinical endpoints, because we just don't have the data yet. And so we're still using large observational population data where most of the people are eating a standard American junk food diet. Most of them are underlying inflammation, hyperinsulinemia, so on and so forth. And so it's interesting, what we're seeing even in people with high cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. We're starting to see very low coronary artery calcium scans, which would give you kind of a long-term snapshot of what's going on with your cardiovascular health. It's not perfect, but it is a very good. Many people consider it a very good tool. We're actually even seeing, to some degree, reversal of calcification, which would be improvement in cardiovascular disease. And so that's actually occurring now. Now that hasn't been published yet, but I think that's probably going to be done in the near future because people are collecting case reports, and I think we're going to see that in the literature probably in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think I heard you make a good analogy again on another podcast where you said it's kind of like starting a fire, right? You need wood to start a fire, but wood on its own, absent a spark and absent kindling and absent whatever else, you don't have to worry about it catching fire, And I think the concerning part is that it is looked at in isolation by so many people who are prescribing statins and things of that nature today. I have examples in my own family. And perhaps it's somewhat rational because maybe they just assume that everybody is on a standard American diet. And in that case, they probably do have sufficient inflammation and maybe other risk factors that maybe make it acceptable. But, my opinion is like, why would you only, like, again, you've talked about this before too, but if you're not looking at LDL in conjunction with triglycerides, HbA1c, inflammatory markers, then, if all of those are good, then the data seems to suggest that LDL is not really much of a problem. Those markers may be the fire and the kindling and the other stuff in the fire analogy, right? But if all of those things are lower in healthy levels, then I saw a report, I think it was published relatively recently over the last year or so, but it was that high LDL actually was a marker for decreased mortality. Like the higher the LDL, the less mortality. So it seems like the narrative around LDL is in need of shifting, especially when we consider that so many people are being prescribed based on that metric alone.
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with just the state of the modern healthcare system, where it's really a conveyor belt. It's high volume, high turnover.
Right.
You don't have a lot of time to go into nuance and to sort of put everybody in individual sort of buckets. I mean, everybody, and you're right. I mean, if I say a fire requires oxygen and a lightning strike and some wood, I mean, generally there's oxygen around and generally lightning sometimes strikes. So I think that's the attitude that most people take. It's like we assume that those factors are going to be in place and we don't need to bother investigate them, because in 88% of the population, which are considered metabolically unhealthy, that's pretty good betting odds that if you reduce your LDL for the general population, they're going to generally do better. But again, if you particularly if you're your own advocate and you understand that there's more nuance here, and most physicians, I mean, I cannot tell you even today in 2019, when there's all this evidence out there that shows that LDL is not particularly a good isolated factor for predicting heart disease. I mean, at least look at things like oxidized or glycated LDL or particle count, or some of the ratios, HDL total cholesterol ratios or triglyceride HDL ratios. But there's still many people making a knee-jerk decision for lifelong medication and, based on a single LDL reading, which in my view is kind of insane.
Yeah.
And, the patients don't question it. They get put on their statin and they stay on it for 20, 30 years. And that's the end of the story. And there's probably a lot of people that are unnecessarily medicated to do that. And you are correct. LDL, I mean, this is all in the context of cardiovascular disease, but when we step away from cardiovascular disease and start looking at all-cause mortality, because we all got to die of something.
Right.
And for me, maybe dropping dead of a heart attack at 95 is not so bad, whereas my other option could be maybe 3 years of cancer or 10 years of dementia or, infectious disease or, suicide or something like that. And we see that having low levels of LDL seem to put you at higher risk for those other problems, and there's a number of studies showing that the lower your LDL is, the higher risk of just dying from any disease, not necessarily cardiovascular, but you're going to die for something. Maybe it's going to be cancer. So I think we have to, I think there has to be a more nuanced discussion around LDL.
Yeah, I've also seen some of the data on the neuroprotective effects, right? The higher the LDL, the less incidences of things like dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that. So, yeah, it does seem...
I was going to say it's interesting. There's new drugs out there. These I think there's PSCK9 inhibitors, which, I mean, they get their LDL cholesterol down to unprecedentedly low levels. I mean, whereas normal is around 100 to 120, 130, they're taking these people down below 30. Some places below 10, and I just suspect we're going to see some really interesting outcomes in those people, and they may not be interesting in a good way. They may be interesting in a very, very concerning way.
Yeah, and there's so little recourse. If your doctor prescribes this, first of all, if you come in and say, "Hey, I fished around on Google and it looks like LDL is not so bad," the doctor's going to roll their eyes and say, "Hey, I'm a doctor. I've got the experience here. So, don't give me that crap." And I sympathize with that attitude because I'm sure everyone's coming in these days thinking they know, what's going on. But nevertheless, the patient has very little recourse. And, I've even people who are highly educated and who you listen to, people like yourself and various other people that, and most importantly, the recent data, the last 10 years of data and meta-analyses and things of that nature that indicate that, just looking at LDL in isolation and then prescribing a statin off the back of that is probably not the best course of action. Once a doctor prescribes something, it gains a gravity that you're really apprehensive about going against, because you just think like you got all this data and reason on one side, but you got the gravity of that authority figure on the other side saying, do this for your health, and you don't want to take the risk of being wrong because, it could be, well, it's life and death in some cases. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is scary. I mean, I think that, obviously it's your body. You do not have to accept being on a medication if you feel strongly against that. I mean, whether or not that's in your best interest or not is hard to say, the outside of the context of one specific incident. And you also have the right, in many cases, hopefully, depending on where you live, to pursue a different physician. I mean, there are many physicians out there that are, supportive of, at least accepting that there are more things to worry about with regards to risk than just LDL cholesterol, and they're willing to monitor it and support you. And, I cannot tell you the number of people that, they come in and, everything has gotten better in their life. Every single objective clinical measure, they lose 100 pounds, their diabetes goes away, they come off all medication, their joint pain goes away, their depression goes away, they get off every medication, and, their cholesterol goes up, and somehow the doctor thinks, well, it's really bad, and it's like, wait a minute, being 100 pounds overweight is way worse in my view. And I think many people who are, probably looking at this from a more practical standpoint would say that person has, by and large, dramatically improved their overall health outlook. And to say that they are now at higher risk for whatever, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Shawn, last two, and they're quick. The second last one is, I know you've been asked about your blood labs several times, and in the podcast I listened to, I didn't hear you divulge that information. I think on Joe's podcast you hadn't done it yet, and on some others you were waiting to talk about it on another podcast. But whether it's yours or whether it's the people that you've been advising or people in your community, I mean, what is the role of a blood lab in the carnivore diet? Like, is there things that people should be looking out for? Are there, what's the role of it aside from your own subjective, I feel good and strong and that's good enough?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think, it's not that labs are unnecessary. I mean, but I think we sometimes impart more value to them, outside of what's going on clinically. And so I think you have to, if you're going to get labs, and I don't necessarily discourage people from doing that, but you need to understand what we know and what we don't know about those labs. And we need to get a complete picture. Like I said, if you're going to get your glucose, you probably should know what your insulin is doing. If you're going to get your LDL, you should probably get, maybe an advanced lipid panel. I mean, these things are, it's often anxiety provoking for people, because there's a lot of people that are, we call them biohackers, where, I mean, they're measuring constantly, and every variable, whether we understand it or not, and even the physicians say, I don't really know what that means. They're in there and they're trying to make some sense out of, why did my LDL or why did my HDL go down 3 points compared to last time? Am I doing something wrong? And it causes some anxiety and a sense of panic when, you're looking, well, how are you doing clinically? And they're like, I still feel great. So, I mean, it's just one of those things where you have to sort of put it in perspective, understand what's going on clinically. I still value clinical, clinical endpoints become more important to me than what's going on in your blood at, 8:15 a.m. on Tuesday. I mean, that could be completely anomalous. In fact, if I were to draw 100 different lab panels on you, even if you were in perfect health and everything was ideal, and we just knew, for example, that you are just as ideal, as optimal as you could be, at perfect body composition, no clinical problems whatsoever, and I drew your blood, I drew 100 labs, probably 20 of them would be outside of normal range. And then all of a sudden we say, well, why is this? Maybe we need to take this supplement, or maybe we need to change this food. And I think it in many cases, it creates more problems than it solves. Now, if you're sick, if there's an issue, if you've been dealing with, say, thyroid disorder, and you've had chronically, elevated levels of TSH, and you want to see how the diet is impacting that, that seems to make sense. There are some basic screening labs that everybody gets that, may or may not be important. I think I like to look at long-term indicators of health, and the labs are very short-term indicators. It's what happened in the last 30 seconds in your bloodstream. And so if we were to say, for instance, coronary artery calcium test, over 45, you can get an idea of what's been going on in the last 10 years. Have you been doing the right things or not? Hopefully it's, like mine was zero. I had a perfect coronary artery calcium scan despite eating gobs of fat and gobs of steak for, almost a decade, right? So, I mean, that's important to me, just a simple waist to height measurement, because that will tell you a lot about what's going on. I mean, it doesn't matter. There are people out there that are morbidly obese that have really nice labs. I mean, they look on paper, wow, you look at their labs and say, this person's great. But then you look at them and you're like, wow, this person really has some issues that they've got to deal with. And so, like I said, that's why I ask people what labs, should you get? And I just say, what do you really want to know? And, what are you going to compare it to? And what context are you going to use it in? And that's kind of how I look at those.
So is it fair to say that when you did yours, you derived no insights that caused any change in approach? Everything was acceptable to you?
Yeah, I didn't do any changes. I mean, I saw a number of things that, were kind of cool. I mean, but there were some things that other people raised a lot of people's eyebrows. Like I said, for instance, my inflammatory markers were almost completely zero. My kidney and liver function tests were normal. My insulin sensitivity was extremely high. Which goes with my general clinical sort of description. But there were people concerned that my blood glucose was elevated, and it was relatively higher than you'd like to see. It was in the 120s, and so people said, "Well, you're obviously you're diabetic or pre-diabetic," and I'm like, "Well, clinically, that is not going on. First of all, my insulin was super low, and so we realized there's a relationship between insulin and blood glucose, and then also we have to put in the fact that I'm kind of an outlier from an athletic standpoint. In fact, that I'm actually breaking world records, and I'm competing and training in a way that's requiring a lot more glucose than the average person would need, and we have gluconeogenesis because I'm eating no glucose. I'm not taking any in, so I'm making all the glucose that I need. And for what reasons do I need higher blood glucose? Because I'm performing at a level that requires a lot of glucose.
Right.
And when we look at other athletes, and there's been some studies on other athletes, and the same phenomenon is happening. High level, high performance athletes engaged in highly glycolytic sprinting type training see their blood glucose go up. And so I understood that physiology. And like I said, it would be the other argument would be, well, my insulin's so low that I'm a type 2 diabetic that's turning into a type 1.5 diabetic, and my liver is, my pancreas is failing, and I'm not going to be producing any more insulin anymore. I'm going to be an insulin dependent guy. And that just doesn't go with the clinical findings, because I have no problem making insulin when I need it. And I looked at my, what it did do was have me check my glucose on a regular basis with a glucometer, because I was like, well, this is interesting. I want to know more. And then I saw that my glucose, while it was higher in the morning, it was extremely, extremely stable throughout the day. Even after meals, it would even sometimes go down after a meal, which is kind of a neat phenomenon, because that's probably the few times that I was actually putting out insulin. It's because when I was, when I got some protein, I have a little insulin spike, and then it would, force my glucose into the cells. So, I didn't really, like I said, at the end of the day, what concerns me is my own personal function, and I think that's more informative to me. And I, like I said, I've seen literally tens of thousands of labs on people, and I know like some of it's relevant and some of it's not. So you have to put it in perspective clinically.
Right. Final question: how do we make Dr. Shawn Baker a Bitcoiner? What's it going to take for you to finally make the plunge? You're ripe. I can tell. This has to happen.
Well, I just need to start getting more income. I've got to get enough income to start investing. That's probably the biggest thing there. Then I probably need someone that can kind of guide me through it and get me, kind of help me lose my Bitcoin virginity, so to speak, and so I don't mess it up, and get make some silly mistakes.
Well,
so.
Conventional wisdom is this. It's very simple. Instead of thinking about it as kind of like a big lump sum investment, every month you squirrel away $10, $50, $100, whatever it is, and what's become the most popular meme in the space is called stacking sats. A Satoshi is the smallest denomination of a Bitcoin. There's 100 million Satoshis in a Bitcoin. It's divisible that way. And so you just stack those Satoshis, you stack those sats, you don't think about it, you don't think about other coins, you find a safe way to store it, buy it on a regular basis, and over time it adds up, and then you're involved and you're starting to learn, and your funds are appreciating based on the growth of the Bitcoin and the Bitcoin network. So a lot of people tend to maybe overcomplicate it, but the thing is just get started, and as you go along, I'm sure you'll get further down the rabbit hole. And the reason why I'm asking you, of course, is because I know the community would love to have someone like you involved, and know that you're a Bitcoiner, and obviously a very important voice in the diet and nutritional space. So.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not opposed to it at all, and like I said, that's something that hopefully I can do. I guess what do you call it, hodling? HODL.
That's right.
The transposition error that turned into the type of thing there. But yeah, no, I'm definitely interested. Like I said, I know Michael and I know Safe, and I'm sure those guys could get me.
They could absolutely get you set up. But if
you set up well, it's just a matter of pulling the trigger, I suppose.
Yeah, if you need any information, I'm available as a resource too. So just
what I'll do is I will try to make 2020 that year that I do that. How's that sound? I'll put a pledge that that'll be my New Year's resolution for 2020, just to put some money into Bitcoin, or put some, and then just keep it for however long it makes sense.
Sounds good. Look, Shawn, thanks so much for the time. I know we went a bit over, but you're just such a wealth of knowledge, and this is such an interesting topic for me, and I know everybody else who's listening. So I appreciate the time. You've got a book coming out in November, right?
Yeah, The Carnivore Diet by Shawn Baker, MD. It's out November 19th. It's up for pre-order. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and a couple other places for international distribution. I think I got those links on my Instagram, Shawn Baker 1967. So hopefully, it seems like it's going to do well. I mean, the pre-sales have already been pretty good. So I've got Simon & Schuster's is a publisher via Victory Belt. So we should have hopefully a pretty good run with that, I suppose. And hopefully it'll get this information out to the masses in a larger way, and drive the conversation. And then maybe we won't have so many darn sick people. They can be healthy. They can be healthy and hang on to some Bitcoin.
Absolutely, man. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I think it's going to have a really big impact. I'm looking forward to it coming out. So I wish you the best of luck with that, and keep doing the awesome work that you're doing. I'm sure it's helping so many people and really having a big multiplier effect. So just keep up the great work.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks, John.
All right, brother. Take care of yourself.
All right. You off the